Yeah, we got it.
We got it? All right.
We're golden.
All right. In this video, we're going to talk about a book that is so beautiful, we're going to have to burn it.
Burn it down.
All right, welcome to the CodeX Cantina. I am Una.
And I am the very cheerful Crypto.
And we are going to be doing something rare on this channel. We are doing the one and done with the Temple of the Golden Pavilion by Yukio Mishima. Usually we go into several videos. We're trying a new thing here to kind of see how it goes. So we're going to do one video on this. So if you would like to join us on literature discussions where we go into big detail, please consider subscribing.
All right, let's kick off with publication information. This book was written in 1956, and then it was translated to English by Ivan Morris in 1959. And I'm not going to attempt many of the Japanese names because I am terrible at them.
This was written by, I'm not very good at this name either, but it's Hiraoka Kimitake. But his pen name is Yukio Mishima, so we're just going to call him Yukio Mishima under his pen name for the remainder of this video. Now, he wrote this when he was 31, and I'm going to put a picture of him.
Dude is shredded.
Up on the screen so that we can make sure we're talking about the same Yukio Mishima. So he was a bodybuilder, an actor, a model, a swordsman, and a literary critic.
The guy's the man.
Did you notice any patterns about that?
Oh yeah, he's all about the aesthetics.
He is. Bodybuilder is a very visual art, if you will. The actor, a visual way of telling stories. Model, obvious there. Swordsman, a very physical, in-person activity as well. And then you get to literary critic, where that doesn't really fit the mold traditionally. And we looked into his background because this is one of those rare situations where the author is just so fascinating. You kind of fall down the rabbit hole with him. But he's got kind of that background where his grandmother wouldn't let him join physical sports. His father shamed him for his literary efforts, kind of calling them effeminate. So he was raised to kind of suppress.
Now, this guy is so interesting. He has an autobiography called Sun and Steel, which I hope we can do at some point in time. It's very expensive, like hundreds of dollars for a paperback version. But at some point in time, we're going to have to get into this guy's life because it is an incredible, fascinating tale. Almost as cool, if not cooler than this book. And this is a good book.
And it's not biographical, this story. This is let's get to the story. It's a fictionalized story of when the Kinkakuji, the Golden Pavilion, was burned to the ground in real life. And it was done by a monk of the temple. And in the court cases, it says that he did it because he was protesting the commercialization of it. And this temple was very important to Japan. I mean, we're going back to the 1400s when this thing was built. A shogun lived there. There's a whole village around it. There was these Onin wars where the wars destroyed the village, but the temple still stood.
Yeah, it's a touristy place, so he didn't like all that the tourists were coming there and they commercialized it.
It became a symbol because of this, because it survived the war, because there was fires all over Kyoto. This temple never burned down. World War II happened where the Allies bombed the mainland Japan, but they didn't bomb Kyoto. And Kyoto, and particularly this Kinkakuji, was never once destroyed during all this time. So it became this stalwart, this symbol, beyond its beauty, about the representation of it just always being able to survive these things, right? An aesthetic thing to the general public.
Yeah.
So it really shook Japan when an actual monk burned it to the ground. And not long after, a couple years later, Yukio Mishima writes the story, a fictionalized version of the story. And he actually went to the jail to interview the guy that did the burning, if you didn't know.
Yeah, I saw that he went there and he talked with him and got some information, some firsthand accounts of that to embed and make his story more believable.
Allegedly, he didn't get any new information. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But he definitely took some things from this guy who did stutter, just like the main character in the story, but made it his own creation for the motives behind it, which I think Japan is searching for that, right? Like they still aren't sure why this thing, this horrible thing happened. So here's this author's interpretation of it.
Yeah, you can definitely see him playing a little bit probably with the truth here to make it more entertaining.
Now, in terms of my personal reaction, I really did like this piece, but I would warn people that this dances the line between literary fiction and philosophy. There's definitely this feeling of kind of like, if you've ever read Persig's The Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, some of you that'll instantly put you off. It doesn't go to that level of intensity. It doesn't go to that level of assumptiveness, but it does do some pontification and philosophy moments in this that will make you think and kind of not just be a for fun story, I feel like.
Yeah, I think main issue with this is that there is not a massive lot of dialogue. There is not a lot of action. It's a lot of introspective thinking on the main character's part as he's reflecting upon his own thoughts and feelings and how he's growing and how he's changing or how he's not growing and changing, more so than this action-packed, tale of this monk burning down a temple. It's not that at all.
And it's worth saying we partly chose this because of the maybe Midrash, where we wanted to see what kind of Buddhist and Shinto influence were drawn out in this piece.
I really think that Mishima does a great job of kind of taking Western and Eastern ideas and combining together, because in the story you have those two philosophies of East and West meeting the main character and some people from America during World War or after World War II and into the Korean War as well.
Right. I mean, if you think about it, Japan was a country that was shut off for hundreds of years from external influence. And all of a sudden after the war, they're entering more of a westernization front that's kind of happening. There's a demilitarization happening from the country. And then you have Mishima, who still believes in imperialism and was pushing for imperialism in his life, like, kind of an interesting take, I feel like, on the story.
Yeah. So he wanted to restore power to the emperor, and that's a little bit more about his life that he's embedding into the story, I think, and filling in some of those gaps for this fictionized version of it, where he wanted to restore the emperor to power and put Japan back to the way that it was prior to World War II.
All right, so let's jump into our discussion. We're close enough. We're not going to do a plot since this is the whole book. But feel free to click away at this point in time if you're like, hey, I don't want any spoilers at all. We're going to jump into our discussion. And I kind of want to break it down into Buddhism and Shintoism to kind of like tie in our maybe Midrash observations. I want to look at what was his obsession with the temple. And I also kind of want to talk about why didn't he kill himself at the end? Does that sound fair?
Yeah, that's good. And in there, I think we should do some subplot points talking about mental illness and talk about relationships and talk about his growth as an individual.
So I would say first and foremost, when it comes to this Buddhism and Shintoism, neither Crypto nor I are experts on it. We are trying to get more into it, and we are doing some research on some nonfiction Shintoist and such works. But when it comes to Buddhism particularly, I did have a minor in East Asian language studies, and I took some Buddhism classes from a secular research perspective, right?
Yeah, and I've had a minor in religion. I went to a Catholic school, but I studied Buddhism, Hinduism, Shintoism, Zoroastrianism, studied all of those for several years in college.
But for all intents and purposes, I would say I still feel like a beginner.
Yeah.
But I feel like if you were even like no introduction to Buddhism and you're just like, hey, I want to read some Japanese literature, and you pick this up, I feel like you may be missing some things if you don't really look at this from a Buddhist perspective about how the world is suffering and about how attachment to things, attachment to worldly items, I should say, is a huge no-no when it comes to Buddhism. Right?
Most people in the West are Christians of some sort of denomination, then maybe they can empathize a little bit. But I still think that with no knowledge on Buddhism whatsoever, you're still going to be a little bit confused.
Well, you just might interpret things differently than maybe how it's intended, and that's okay.
Or question things, maybe I should say, is like, well, why would he do that? Or why would he say that? Or why would he think that? Because you personally would not in maybe the same situation, right?
Yeah, so I wrote down, destroying the temple was partly about changing the world by removing the perfect beauty and distraction of it. This was a benevolent and evil act in his mind, and he knew it was both. So I think we're going to kind of dissect that a little bit in these next few sections, but I kind of wanted to just put out a statement there real quick, where he said that he was going to take the golden rule of their lives will be turned upside down, to quote the book.
I think that one thing that people might have confusion about the temple and him burning it down is the sacredity of it, because they're going to think of, temple, synagogue, church, like they're going to put those all together, and they're not all exactly similar. I know that when I teach my students, I always try to get them to envision those are similar, but they're definitely not identical or don't serve the exact same purposes. So that's something too, is you have to get around, is that the temple is not necessarily like a Christian church or a Jewish synagogue or a mosque for, a Muslim. So you also have to understand the difference there in the building itself.
Yeah, that's a really good point. All right, so in terms of Shintoism, since we're not going into super, super detail, it took me a while to break that habit. I read this first chapter, and my notes from the first chapter are about a third of the rest of my notes of this book. But I wanted to bring up just some quick ironical things that kind of happened when they were walking up to the shrine, I believe it was, or was it a temple? I can't remember. But they pass Sasankwa, which is a Japanese representation of lovers or love. So it's interesting that Uiko is about to betray her lover as she's passing these symbols of love or lovers, like the flower. They talk about the trees being cut down, and when it comes to Shintoism, they have a very we're all connected kind of mentality. If you've ever seen, like, Princess Mononoke, there's a lot of environmentalists' works, and all of, I guess, Miyazaki's works, if you've seen those before. But that is like a part of we are all connected, heaven, earth, and like the spirit world, if you will, in Shintoism. We'll go more into that in our Shintoist talks, but I wanted to bring up that they were talking about some of those things being cut down, the irony of her passing her lover, all in the opening thing are all kind of like Shintoist ideals, and they talked about the steps being white, right? They were covered in moss. Those steps weren't white. White represents purity. In Shintoism, it's a cleansing. So here she is doing this betrayal act, walking up these white steps, which are typically representative of purity. There's a lot of irony and underlying Shintoist themes there that can be easy to miss. I just wanted to point those out real quick, that if you go into a deeper dive into this book, there's tons of things like that. This book is riddled with literary things to discuss.
Yeah, there's a lot here. And if you don't have that background, you're obviously going to miss those and think that it's just a lot of flowery language or filler. And that could be a detriment to you enjoying this book.
I see what you did there with the flowery language. All right. What's the obsession with the temple? Let's start with Stuttering and the internal versus external world, Crypto.
So first I want to start off and talk about what is his obsession with this temple. And the first thing that you will learn early in the story is that Mizo has a stutter, and he believes that words are the only way or the most important way to connect with other people in the world. And since he stutters, he struggles to connect with other people in life. And that kind of sets the tone for the whole book, that he's going to have these problems connecting with all of these other characters through the book, and that's going to limit his interaction with them, and it's going to stunt his growth as a social individual.
And he wants to relate externally, right? We have this quote where he says, "Whatever happened, it was essential that the Golden Temple be beautiful. I therefore staked everything, not so much on the objective beauty of the temple itself, as on my own power to imagine its beauty." And that's bringing out the objective reality, the outside world, if you will, the ability to relate to others, right? And then there's Mizo as he knows himself, his internal beauty, which is kind of the subjective internal world that is being explored. And as Crypto was just saying, he can't relate his internal world outwardly as well as other people can.
Yeah, and so we have another quote for that. It said in the book, "People probably think they can't see themselves unless they have a mirror, but to be a cripple is to have a mirror constantly under one's nose." So he even recognizes his own problems with this, but the problem through the story is that he really doesn't want to fix it. And he doesn't care to either. And so that's going to come back as a recurring theme throughout the entire story.
Well, he starts off with the schoolboy, if you remember in the beginning. And the schoolboy, his sense of pride, if you will, was the sword. And what he did is he specifically wrote on the sword. The idea is he's besmirching the outside world since he can't relate. He's specifically defiling the external world, his sense of pride through this action.
Yeah, I love when he scars it. He marks it up. That's great. I felt like he was getting back a little bit at the bully there. It was the only way that he knew how for retribution.
Yeah, it was good. So arguably, the temple, okay, it might be his escape from defilement is something that I kind of want to explore with you here today. Because one of the ideas is, how do you escape the outside world? You go to your room, right? You don't talk, right? But how do you escape your inside world? You can't escape yourself, right? So the idea is, some people might come to is, do you destroy yourself when you're not happy with it?
Yeah. And whereas we're going to see the temple is representing in the real world the physical manifestation of his internal self.
And I think it's interesting too. I like this quote here, because although beauty may give itself to everyone, it does not actually belong to anybody.
Ooh, that's good.
So I like that idea of normally I think of, like we started talking about this inability for Mizo to relate outwardly, and the stutter being his deformity, as they say in this book. But it's interesting to think about it from the temple's perspective of how it gives beauty to everyone, but it doesn't belong to anyone. Even though it's objective, it doesn't belong to anyone. Everyone owns, though, their own subjective version of it. Everybody owns their own internal voice, but they don't own the external voice, is kind of what he's exploring here.
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful, beautiful way of saying beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
So next, let's move on to impotence and sexuality when it comes to what this temple means, okay? Because in chapter 3, we have the father covering his eyes, which is covering his innocence from his mother sleeping with this other guy. So he sees defilement happening, and he's being protected, the innocence. And I think that comes down to suppression and what we were talking about earlier with Yukio Mishima's real life, where he had to suppress his physical activities. He had to suppress his desire for the literary arts because it was considered effeminate. It comes back to kind of like that stereotype of the preacher's daughter, what happens to her when she grows up and goes to college. She goes wild, right?
Yeah.
Or you have those people that go drink and party all the time. Eventually they calm down and suddenly they become the churchgoer or the guy that's like just, real polite and stuff like that. Sometimes when you suppress or hide certain things that are inside of you, it lashes back out later.
Yeah, this is his Rumspringa.
So throughout this piece, you're going to see him refer to Uiko. And Uiko was his source of beauty that got defiled. It was taken away in a sense.
Yeah, before he sees the temple, that his ideal on he's putting her up on a pedestal.
That and his mother's defilement, if you will, those start the suppression acts within Mizo, who is not able to relate external. So he can't escape his internal demons that he's fighting at this point of this sexual defilement.
Yeah, and then he goes so far as wanting things to happen because it might be the only way that he actually feels something. And we'll see that happen several times throughout the story as well. He wants these bad things to happen because it's the only time that he can feel joy, maybe.
He gets permission first, right? Like, he sees Father Dosen with the geisha. Right? Geisha it's not exactly a prostitute. They are,
but it's close.
They are entertainers, and in some cases, it can be close to that. So, either way, if you look at it from the Buddhist eyes, of course, they shouldn't be seeking those worldly attachments and possessions and stuff like that, right? Just like in clerical activities in the West, Buddhist monks are supposed to be celibate as well.
So Kashwagi does the exact same thing. His friend uses his own deformity, the club feet, to lure women in to sleep with them. And he's trying to convince Mizo to do the same thing. Be like, hey, don't look at that as a negative thing, your stutter. Use that to get sympathy. And Mizo doesn't want sympathy at all. That actually repulses him of wanting this sympathy. So that idea of one of his own friends doing it is also, I think, frustrating for him.
Well, it's they even called it out at one point. Every time Kashiwagi enters the scene, he slowly starts to manipulate Mizo to do more and more things that are wrong. It always starts with a small ask, and then it gets bigger and bigger, such as with the flute, and then asking for the flowers from the temple, which is defiling the temple. You see him start to pervert and offer it. Well, I'm getting kind of ahead of myself here real quick. Let's stick to the sexual side of real quick before we get into Kashiwagi. But I wanted to talk about the final chapter. Did you notice some of the word choices in that chapter?
No, what words are you specifically referring to?
So every time Mizo's expected to be intimate, which he's already had his own internal view of that defiled, what happens to him?
Oh, he can't perform.
He's impotent, right? He loses power. Now, the final scene, I'm going to point some word choices here. Now, we've, of course, had the Japanese translated to English. I have to go with what the English says. But there's so many here, this can't be a coincidence. I want you to think about Freud, with the idea that everything that can be penetrated is meant to represent femininity, and everything that can penetrate something else or long and cylindrical is masculinity. Okay? And this isn't all of them. I just wrote down some of them as I was going through just the last chapter when he's in the temple. Okay? The offertory box had several wood slots in which to insert things.
Sorry, I shouldn't giggle.
He slid sideways into the tight opening of the temple. The scepter rested in the statue's hands. He put his hand into the water, and when he pulled it out, it was covered in duckweed. Great dark gulf of his life, and the entire structure became narrow, and a forest of narrow pillars surrounded him. His entire conception, I don't know what the translation is from conception, but I'm going with the English one, his entire conception of beauty, ... The temple revealed itself to him. I like this one. This is my favorite. This is my favorite one. The delicate exterior had become intimately intermingled with the interior.
You're going to make me blush.
Here's the last one that I wrote down. For the vast power of sensual desire, ... endless shimmering of sensual desire. So while he's been impotent and cut off from the real world, I say cut off, he's inhibited with his stutter. He's inhibited with his understanding of what happened to Yuiko and to his mother. We now see him realize his dreams of entering, quote unquote, the temple. And he's been impotent every time. He just blanks out. He's tried to be intimate with someone because there's this disconnect with what he thinks it should be, his internal view, and the objective thing, what it is. Like same thing with like the prostitute in the second night. Here he is going into the temple, and there are so many sexual references made at this part. He's finally realizing his combination of the objective and the subjective at this point in the culmination of this chapter.
Whew, I need a cigarette.
All right, so we started to get a little bit ahead of ourselves, but one of the last points that I wanted to bring up was that defilement thing that we were talking about. And I think it's this idea that Tsurukawa and Kashiwagi are kind of opposed and are representing, I don't want to say, the good angel and the bad angel on his shoulders, but you have definitely two views that are being presented. And I think this is the part that felt the most philosophical to me, was when Kashiwagi or Tsurukawa were talking. One, because you're like, oh, hey, dialogue, that's cool. But two, they're very clearly representing certain things where Tsurukawa, we have this quote, you didn't actually stomp the prostitute, right? He's putting the moralistic view, and they even talk about how he puts a good spin on everything that Mizo says. He's representing the moral and the good. And then you have Kashiwagi, who he says things like, you're talking to me just because I'm a cripple, right? Which was true. It was knowledge. And then there's that one chapter where he talks about how he is knowledge. They even talk about how he's evil and how he kind of creeps in. I don't think it's meant to be double. There's no absolute good, bad in Shintoism, right? It's all about domains, if you will. And you have these two domains of morals and knowledge being put on Mizo. And what happens and he's kind of pulled both ways, what happens to the morals?
They're questioned.
They get killed, right? His friend that represented the morals is killed because, remember, he finds out that he defiled and there's like a woman issue right there. So once that leaves, then you have the search for knowledge and evil creeping into his life. And you see this mental deterioration of Mizoguchi as he starts this relationship with Kashiwagi.
Okay.
So you start to see him start to do things like the stamping of the prostitute, and then he's rewarded with the cartons. That doesn't make sense. The leader of the temple is doing things like he's going out with the geisha when he shouldn't. That doesn't make sense. You get the idea that he's starting to realize that the world is evil, and people are taking parts in these sort of things in their lives.
And people that shouldn't be.
So ultimately, he comes to the conclusion that he needs to kill his own impotence in this. He needs to kill his own problems that he's had since a child. And that's represented in this penetration and destruction of the temple at the end, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think you did a beautiful job of wrapping that all up.
Anything else? Well, I appreciate it. I put some thought into it, but it's kind of hard with this new format of doing a whole book in one. We don't have as much time to explore and really go into detail on these themes. Is there anything else you wanted to cover?
Yeah, so I think the last thing that we could talk about is why didn't he kill himself? You come to the end of the story, and he burns the temple down, and he runs out, And at the end, he's just like, all right, it's okay to be alive. And that's going to be difficult for some people to maybe understand or comprehend, maybe. Because I know that personally, even after having all this information and discussing it with you, I was still a little bit, that's interesting. Why did he write the story and have it end that way? Because it could have easily gone the other way, right? He easily could have died in the temple, and maybe you would have felt happy by that or sad. That obviously is going to be a lot of you internally of what you personally believe and feel.
Well, let's go back to the first chapter on that one. What is on top of the temple?
Yeah, so it all comes back to the Phoenix, and you explained to me that there's actually different variations of, again, Western and Eastern. You got to know those differences of the Phoenix.
Well, they call out, though, when they say in the book the classical version of the Phoenix, that's our version of the Phoenix, of a rebirth with that. So they are talking about our classical Phoenix in this story.
That right there is going to be this rebirth of him. And if you believe that him burning the temple, Phoenix burning, is being reborn, he is set out to do what he was supposed, or what he felt he's supposed to do, to fix himself. And maybe this realization that it was successful, and then he doesn't want to die or doesn't feel he needs to die, that he has cleansed himself, he has fixed himself, and that he's going to go forth, and maybe have a better life.
I like the way the book describes it, because it says, the golden phoenix on top of the temple never crows or flaps its wings. It must forget it's a bird. So I think you can start to take some of that symbology here with Mizo. I wrote down, in the same way that Mizoguchi had his talk about actions and words, where he always looks for words, which he can't do, instead of taking action. This bird on top of the temple, right, can't relate to the outside world the same way that he does. The bird doesn't know it's a bird. So does this mean that Mizoguchi might have problems understanding who he is without relating to the outside world? And that's when he burns the temple at the end, that he's burning his relationship with the outside world. He no longer needs to, we talked about earlier about that internal defilement. He no longer needs to kill that when he's destroyed that. All he has left is his subjective view of things. That's how I interpreted why he didn't need to do it. It's kind of like a rebirth of the Phoenix. It's also kind of like well, now that I've killed the objective side of things, I only have my subjective view of things. And it's this this nihilism in him that allows him to kind of move on with the world after that.
Yeah, I like that. I think, too, this is one of the few actions that he takes in the whole story, right? We discussed that there might be only 2 actions that he's actually taken in the story. It was everybody else deciding for him. He decides to stomp on the prostitute, and he decides to burn the temple. And those are some pretty pivotal moments in his life where things kind of changed for him drastically. And you could argue that those are the only changes that mattered to him externally that affected him internally. Yeah.
All right, so let's move into our subjective ratings of this book. This is kind of an interesting piece for me. I would say this is a piece that I could easily probably return to in the future, because I imagine I might have a different interpretation of everything that I just said right now. Maybe some of the philosophical ponderings that Kashiwagi went through might hit me differently, right? Like the way that he kept hitting the Nanzen kills a kitten, like 3 different ways, explained 3 different times to mean 3 different things. I think you can take some of that with this book as well. I'm going to go with a 7.5. I feel like on a subjective scale of how I felt about it for this one.
Nice. That's really close to where I was going to go. I also would love to return to this piece, being that we're trying the format of just one video for an entire book. I think it was, 234 pages or something on my version. So pretty lofty book to try to cram into a 30-minute video with so much information to have to talk about and dissect. We could talk about, women in their roles in this story. We didn't even talk about the mental health issues, of the author and Mizo in the story as well, and what that could really mean. And then the symbology of Western versus Eastern. So much more that you could break down into this story that we didn't get to.
And my good friend Fate, I had some notes here about Fate. And I did want to bring up the woman thing. Maybe we can just talk about it real quick. Okay. I don't know. We've never read this author before. We don't know much about him. But I would say I detected, I think you detected too, that all the women in this were kind of cardboard cutouts. So there is arguably some maybe mild forms of misogyny here where only men are fleshed out in the story.
Yeah, and that's probably maybe, and again, I don't want to stereotype, typical to what a man during his time period would think about women and the Japanese culture, or most cultures around the world for that fact, right?
Right.
Yeah. So I would give this a probably a solid 7. Yeah. Give it a 7.
Well, guys, we appreciate you spending some time to listen to us chat about this book. We'd love to hear what your thoughts are down below. As usual, you're welcome to subscribe to join us on our literary discussions, and let us know what you guys thought about this format. If you've stuck around this long, we'd be curious. Instead of doing, multiple part breakdowns, we thought we'd try doing a 1-part breakdown. And I think we can get away with that for some books. Like maybe this book might have been pushing it a little bit. The Stephen King ones, probably we can do this. But I don't think we could ever get to a 1 video breakdown for like Absalom. It's just not going to happen. But let us know what you thought of the 1 book video breakdown down below.
Peace.